Welcome to our second faculty lecture, and this time it's with Professor Davor Džalto. And he will present his field, Religion, Art and Democracy, which in Swedish we call religion, konst och folkbildning. He is one of the more unique thinkers we have in the Orthodox world today, and he is a kind of contemporary Michel Foucault in his way of addressing contemporary issues. I would even argue that his perspective is very much concerned with unjust structures, structures that create oppression, but also he looks upon religion according to these ways of going post the structures of various organizations, society, and so on, in his effort to bring something of emancipation to the ecclesial world and the society, as well as the ideological conversation of our contemporary time. Now, in this lecture, Davor will present his perspective of theology within society, but also for society, and the rest will be presented by Davor himself. So, the floor is yours, Davor Džalto. Please.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for this introduction. I've never thought about myself as being Foucaultian, but I'll rethink that now after the introduction. So I would like to begin with a call back to theology, with which my dear colleague Cyril Havarun concluded his lecture last time. And of course, that question immediately requires us to think about what we mean by theology, what kind of theology, back to what kind of theology. And there can be different kinds of theologies, as we all know that. Bad theologies, good theologies, theologies that function as ideologies. And in particular, I would try to make a case for what sometimes is known as theology as a critical discourse. Not claiming, of course, that what theology is a critical discourse when it's applied to social and political sphere, that that's all that theology can be or should be, but it can be also that in addition to what theology primarily deals with in a more traditional and more conventional sense. So I would like to begin with a brief reflection on our modern age, what's called modernity very often, and how that complicated and long process that we call modern developments shaped our realities, our societies in which we live nowadays. That are, of course, very complex and very different, but still we can find some patterns in all parts of the world where modernity or Western modernity played a significant role. And in the second part of the presentation, I'll try to be as brief as possible. I want to talk a little bit about that, more about that public sphere, and then also try to indicate the ways in which what seems to me as authentic theology can be useful, can be beneficial for rethinking that public sphere. So I'll really try to be as brief as possible so that we have much more time for later discussion and your comments and your questions, and I'm sure that will be much more interesting part than the first one. Modern age, we can say that, I think, with a lot of courage and certainty, begins with bad theologies. Modern age and its conceptual framing has its roots, or at least that's one way in which we can approach the history of ideas in the period of modernity, in the nominalist crisis. In this late medieval times, when the world and the certainties of the world came to be questioned and effectively were destroyed. And this nominalist crisis removed the certainties and stability that people could have relied on, and introduced this quest for the missing certainty and missing stable foundations that we can read from a variety of different philosophies and different intellectual enterprises over the first centuries of the period we call modernity or modern period, culminating, of course, in the Enlightenment, and later, based on certain developments within the movement we call the Enlightenment, with positivism. It is, of course, a very complicated story, so I will just give you one possible and a very, very, very stylized understanding or picture of those developments. But once those metaphysical foundations of the pre-modern world were profoundly shaken, and once we, or people at that time, or modern human beings, had to rethink the metaphysical foundations of the world, they started looking for some kind of substitutes that ultimately resulted in promoting reason as a way to secure or solidify the grounds of our meaning and our existence. Of course, the discussion later on will be whether it's reason per se or whether it's representations of the reason, which of course is an important discussion, but for this very stylized outline, it's not of fundamental importance. One aspect of that modern reason was also an attempt, very explicit in many of the rationalistic and enlightened thinkers, was that it was supposed to control, to get hold over nature, but then also of the human being, for primarily practical purposes. So to control nature by rational means, and then also to control the human being by understanding what or who the human being is, and by that, what it means in rationalistic terms is, of course, reducing human being to understandable, reasonable categories that can also be then, since they are codified, they are made precise, they are made explicit, they can also be manipulated. We got to somewhat paradoxical place of the whole of the reason within the project of modernity and modernity itself. On the one hand, and some authors have rightly, I think, pointed to that, the modern times and modern ideas very often function as something that has emancipatory potential or wants to liberate human beings from various types of oppressions, whether it be church structures, whether it be social structures, and so on and so forth. And that's why a safe refuge was, for many of those ideological projects, was reason. Because reason, in the light of reason, could have made people see the sources of oppression and do something about it, change it. And then slowly, of course, one stage was to get rid of this either oppressive or uncertain God, or to remove him away from the world as in deistic tradition. And once that was done, the question, of course, was what are we left with? And then the answer was with nature and natural world. And then how can we use our reason to actually liberate ourselves or create more room for our happiness, for leading a more meaningful and better life within this world, natural world. But then, of course, more questions were raised, and we came to the pretty paradoxical situation that the very same reason that was promoted as means of liberation became the source of oppression. And as it has already been pointed out in literature, that we can also see modern totalitarianisms of the 20th century as the culmination of some of those earlier tendencies that search for some kind of absolute security, absolute metaphysical, but then also it's translated into social and political context, which then is also rationalized within one intellectual or ideal framework. And then everything, a variety of what we can naively call reality, then needs to be put inside this conceptual cage. And of course, that became a problem. Belief that only reason can provide stability and happiness is probably in the most vivid way described in Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor, where a self-proclaimed or self-appointed social and political authorities charge themselves with this task to bring happiness, stability, and meaning to the world, which is, of course, something that we later on know as a variety of different oppressive and totalitarian ideologies. But one interesting thing that among all those variety of different concepts and tendencies that we can trace back to the beginnings of the modern period, one particularly is interesting, and that's the one that actually sees the peak of rationality and in itself also the best way of handling the issue of truth in quantification, using very quantifiable data to get to the truth of everything. Truth of nature through natural sciences and practicing a strict method, rationalistic method, logical method, using data to explain society, to quantify, and of course in our times using big data, using algorithms to basically create an image, a hyper-rationalistic image of the world that we very often rely much more on as something much more real than actually what's outside of those data. So in this context, back to theology can be understood as a call, and that would be actually my call, back to a more serious thinking about the relationship between our existence and knowledge. Because if it's true that modernity started with bad theologies, then actually going back to theology can be helpful in rethinking some of those dead ends that modern thinking got us into, creating, of course, in the meantime, with the development of technology and development of society and globalization, many, many more challenges that nobody, of course, could have envisioned 200 or 300 years ago. But then, of course, what kind of theology? Since I should already move to the second part of the presentation, not to make it too long, I would just briefly say that by authentic theology, I mean theology that primarily deals with the issue of love and freedom as that metaphysical or ontic stuff out of which something that we can call ontically real comes from. And this theology, which is in a very fundamental way linked with freedom, means that we should embrace paradoxes and tensions, not trying always to clarify everything, not make everything compatible with one unified whole, a completely explicit and intelligible image, which is what a hyper rationalistic, that at the end as always turns out to be completely irrational approach, how it would like to deal with the world. And why this would be important? Because I think a lot of is lost every time we try to find one framework, clearly definable framework, which needs to be the ultimate horizon of meaning for everything, for the whole variety of life and living prospects and the complexities that we find in the world, whether it be in metaphysical terms or whether it be in social and political terms, trying to specify one, let's say, ideal form of social organization and one set of rules that should be applicable to everybody anywhere in this world. This openness toward paradoxes, toward metaphors, ultimately toward the mystery of existence and transcendental aspects of the world and ourselves, I think can help us rethink also the issue of truth, and can lead us to love as the way of relating to other human beings that bears, I think, many other qualities and allows us to actually explore existence more fully, discover in other human beings and in ourselves other dimensions than the other approach that I tried to briefly outline. So, of course, one may ask, but is this authentic theology relevant to anybody else apart from Christians? And it's a fair question, and I think it doesn't need to be relevant to anybody else, but it should be relevant primarily to Christians and Christian theologians. But those who are also not Christians, not believers, who are not interested in the Christian kind of metaphysical things, they can find here one possible indication, if nothing else than even just as an important intellectual discourse or exercise in the history of ideas that can help even purely, whatever that would mean, secular discourses rethink the issues and problems that we are all facing nowadays. And those issues are manifold. So the other part of my presentation, the other actually part of the title, Back to the Public Sphere, is there to actually warn of the need to create or reinvent an authentic public sphere. Because very often we think and take for granted that in many parts of the world, primarily in the Western Hemisphere, we live in more or less democratic societies, that we have a lot of freedoms, freedom of expression, that we can enter the public sphere without many problems. And out of that discussion in the public sphere, we can create more meaningful policies and ultimately more meaningful and better societies. But I think that this image, apart from the propaganda discourse, just doesn't stand any reality check. Yes, there are certain societies that are freer and more democratic than others, but even in the so-called freest and most democratic, and it's actually hard to think of many examples, we are facing a problem that authentic public sphere as a space where individuals and groups bring their authentic thoughts and attitudes and discuss, that is rapidly diminishing. Instead of discussion, we more and more have agendas. instead of a dialogue in order to understand and come to certain conclusions, we more and more have propaganda discourses that are not interested in a dialogue, that are not interested actually in any kind of exploration of new horizons, but actually in certain particular agendas, notice also very clearly defined, very clearly formulated, and then whoever happens not to think that way, whether it's on the right or on the left or anywhere, is a priori an enemy that the corporate structures or government structures or other structures that fundamentally shape the public sphere then interfere and try to eliminate, whether just from the public sphere or eliminate also in some other ways. So we actually need to reclaim and reinvent this public sphere, because without that, authentic democracy, whatever that would mean, is actually, I don't think it's possible. Part of that is also that many of those limitations of actual freedoms are presented to us as new opportunities and new forms of freedom. And that, of course, has to do with this all-penetrating capitalist logic that has become new metaphysics. But it also has to do, and I'm going back to the first part here in my presentation, to those machines and algorithms that we have developed as a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy from the earlier modern times, when that's the way we started to perceive reality, and that's the way we started a long time ago to imagine that that would be the best or the only truthful way to deal with reality. And we paradoxically come to our contemporary times when human beings are more or less reduced to algorithms. Think about all the gadgets that we all use on a day-to-day basis, that all the time we interact with each other, also with our communities and the rest of the world through leaving our digital traces, digital data that are carefully collected and kept in order to actually produce our virtual images that are referred to as something that is real, and then that retroactively shapes to a significant extent how we live and who we are in what we used to call naively old-fashioned 3D reality. So I think that in this context, authentic theology can help us make sense or make a different sense of these developments, and can also help those who, as I said, are non-believers to see the dangers and also the potential of the human being, and primarily the potential for freedom and love, with more complexity and with more openness toward embracing things that are unfamiliar, that are strange, that can be even repulsive, because that is part of what it means to be a human being and what it means to establish interhuman relationships. So I would stop here and open up the floor for your comments and questions. As you could see, this was not really a thorough exploration of one specific topic, but rather giving you an outline of how I think theology could be understood, how it could be used, if you will, and also how it can be beneficial for our the social and political sphere in which we all live. So, Michael, will you take over now? Or?
Yes. So, my computer is going down. So.
Okay.
Yeah. If you have questions to place, you can place it on the chat. Do you have a chat here?
Yeah, I think so. Chat is here.
Yes. So I will begin with
You begin.
Yeah. So people have the ability to think. Someone here? Daniel is beginning. He doesn't trust me, so yeah.
Just an interesting. Thank you for the presentation. You mentioned that this new authentic theology would be able to harbor, if I can use this word, paradoxes and different. Instead of promoting one thing, one set of reason, one view of society, you're advocating, as I understood it, a way to simultaneously being able to harbor, also, if we can call that, different views at the same time, or paradoxes. Could you develop this aspect?
The question.
Okay, so the question, if you couldn't hear it, was about those paradoxes and whether all of these different prospects and different approaches, even mutually contradictory or mutually exclusive, if I may just add to that, how they can coexist within
in this new way of authentic theology.
Right, in authentic theology, right. Well, that's part of the thing. I still think it is a good idea to try to be specific when we want to do one particular task. So this shouldn't be understood as some kind of unconditional call for let's introduce more irrationalities to fight back too much of rationality. That's not the point, because also irrationality can have a rational structure, and also if you push too much rationality, it ends up in irrationality. So I don't think that actually rational and irrational it's kind of intimately linked, and one is not a good alternative to the other. What I think can rather be done. We are having some experiencing some technical issues, but I hope now they're solved. What can be done is to change the way in which, or if you will, method in which we approach what is that we want to do and how. So in that sense, if we keep primarily in our focus and our understanding this human being and the relationship and freedom, and of course freedom once it's made actual, once it's operational, it manifests itself as creativity, and in interhuman relationships as love, that I think will retroactively contribute to our understanding and also expand what we can do with our concepts. Because if you, for example, if you just in practice how it can be done, read different kinds of theologies. You have some theologies that are very stylized accounts on basically kind of manifestos that call for certain, let's achieve certain things that in a very stylized, very narrow way, and they can, it can be done that way if it makes sense for particular purpose or within a concrete context. But then you have theologies that are actually, then you have theologies that just like you say whatever you want, and that's also not, I think, very helpful. But then you have theologies that seriously engage with intellectual tradition or with real phenomena that are out there that affect our lives, but then also tries to transcend this this world, if you will, in the language of the New Testament, in order to open up room for more complex and more open and kind of understanding of phenomena. And I think when we read really good theologies from our tradition, they are that kind of theologies. So not necessarily they can be, if there is a need to address a specific pressing issue, sure, then it needs to be much clearer and with much less ambiguity. But when we want to explore those metaphysical or let's say transcendental dimensions, I think this ambiguity and also using tropes and metaphors and all of those elements and also apophatic kinds of doing theology, that is actually the only way to do it, to preserve the mystery. And preserving the mystery doesn't mean not doing anything or not saying anything. It rather, I think, means never accepting that a clearly codified, clearly established set of concepts and logical procedures will get to the bottom of that thing that we think is mysterious. And in, I think, theological understanding of the world, everything that really exists, has this eschatological existence, is a mystery. That again, I think it doesn't mean we just don't forget about it and we don't do anything about it. We engage with it, but we are aware that we can never get to the bottom of it. We can never completely capture what is that constitutes the truth of this world or other human being or whatever else is that we deal with in this transcendental sense. Okay, we can.
So, Davor, wouldn't your reflection here today go in line with the present day's mistrust of authorities and media? And is there a way out from this, or are you advocating this mistrust? Or
yeah, well, I think mistrust is partly helpful. Why should we unconditionally trust to media or any of the or the authorities especially? So I think there is this healthy, that's a different thing from just being criticizing everything for no reason. But I think that there is a healthy critical distance that needs to exist. And I don't think that it's necessary that theology is the only one that can help us do that. I don't think that's the case. But as I said, I think it can be helpful when it comes to Christians, and it can also be helpful to those who are not Christians if, for example, they would like to explore what it means to cope with a tension, where you need to preserve both things that appear to a simple rationalistic thinking as being mutually exclusive. Christianity talks about this world and talks about the kingdom of God. And these are two things that are interconnected, but also up to a point mutually exclusive. As long as there is this world, there won't be kingdom of God within this world, and once the kingdom of God arrives, this world will cease to exist. Why? Well, we can develop that, but one answer to that is that this world operates on primarily the laws of necessity, and the future world primarily is based on freedom and love. But that's not a relationship that's mutually exclusive in the sense that no connection between the two is possible. On the contrary, through the incarnation, we are saying, no, there is a strong connection, and there can't be this kingdom of God without this and now, without this and now being transformed and integrated and all that. And that means this preservation of tension, embracing the tension between freedom and necessity. Because in this world we cannot but do that, because we cannot exist within the boundaries of this world in an unconditionally free way. So I think that's one approach that is, of course, theological, But being open to this idea, even outside of the theological sphere, I think can be extremely beneficial. Going back to the question of mistrust to authorities and the media, I think that theology can help us being skeptical in a better way. So analyzing, thinking, but constantly keeping in mind the value of the human being. So whenever we attack, and that's also something that purely secular sphere and secular people can embrace. It's an important lesson there from the Christian tradition, that no matter how angry we may be with individual policies, individual authorities, social political structures, and very often for a very good reason to the media, that no matter how often we target particular problems, and we can be very aggressive about it, that we should never go against human beings. That even those who are in the position of power, they still human beings. And even though we may resist their policies and we may call for many changes, that doesn't mean that we need to be against individual human beings. And I think that's a huge problem, because the current media discourse and also political life is exactly the opposite from what I've just described. It targets individuals, it targets social groups, it wants once somebody is not on the party line of the liberal or the right wing or the conservative spectrum or whatever else, they should be ideally eliminated. And that's, I think, one way in which this, if we call it theological shift, can be useful. So then the second question is, thank you very much for your lecture. What do you think?
Let's combine these two questions.
Yeah, okay, if you had a chance.
The Byzantine liturgy, as such, has been developed in the Byzantine Empire, and it reveals a kind of imperial structure today, with the bishop having a mitre and all the robes and clothes of an emperor today. It's more or less the most that are uninitiated or so on, they would reflect upon liturgy as a kind of totalitarian structure, if you look from it to a very shallow side. So how could we liturgically and let's say ecclesiastically understand the relationship between freedom and love, which we're advocating, and on one hand then hierarchy and power, which is displayed in the liturgy and which is displayed also in our canons in the present order of church?
Mm-hmm. And that's a very, very good question. Well, I think that liturgy, the Eucharist, in itself actually exposes a very anarchist type of relationships. Which of course doesn't mean that there are no different functions, different roles, but they are not necessarily the roles of subordination and domination. The fact that, as it was said in the question, the imperial context shaped even services to exhibit some of those imperial elements. And the fact that then church functioning exhibits those elements even more is something that I see as primarily the infiltration of the logic of this world that we all live with, because we are part of the world. And if you think about it, I'm always puzzled when people, that's not the case with this question, but in general, when people ask and journalists ask about how it's possible that the church is supposed to talk about love and practice love and all of that, but it's a very oppressive structure, or is interested primarily in the money and social and political power and gains and all of that. Well, it's as simple as that. Church functions also in this world as an institution. And just as any other big influential social institution, it has this drive to expand its power and gain more power, establish itself, establish alliances with other power agents, dominate and all of that. And it can do that only insofar as there is no resistance to it. And unfortunately, that's this tragic part of our being in the world. So that means that, again, we are embracing the paradox. On the one hand, exhibiting love for everybody, including church hierarchs and political leaders and everybody else, shouldn't and doesn't need to prevent us from resisting policies and resisting oppression, concrete acts of oppression, where we detect them and then we fight them back. I don't see that that's mutually exclusive. Both can be practiced at the same time. So I think there are real power structures and hierarchical institutions. Whether that comes out of the nature of liturgy and Eucharistic gathering, I don't think so. I think that is exactly a different mode with services there and concrete functions that everybody performs that are supposed to image this heavenly existence. But of course, as soon as we get out of that context, liturgical gathering, which also shouldn't be idealized in a sense of some disembodied existence that just is by chance here and now physically, but actually is completely something else. No, it is really here and now because it is supposed to bring this here-ness and now-ness into the kingdom of God and everybody who's there and the whole world actually. But because it is part of this world, it is quite natural, I think, to expect to see many of these tensions and attempts to use power and abuse power and dominations and all of that. So I think that's just part of this world.
So then I will continue on this path. And aren't you in a kind of situation where you separate the liturgy from the rest of the church life, where the liturgy after the liturgy will be unconnected with the liturgical structure? Or would you even jeopardize to be in a situation where you make a kind of Platonic interpretation of liturgy, where you have real ideas behind the surface structure?
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't that be a problem?
Yeah, I see that it could be understood that way, but and there are many who understand, I think, that way. But and the danger is real, but that's not, I think, what I'm trying to say. And the reason is this: I never make a clear cut between the Eucharist and liturgical gathering and the rest of the church. There is no that disconnect. But at the same time, I don't think that the two are one and the same without any differentiation. So the fact that we have the liturgy, and then the fact that some of those who participate in the liturgical gathering also perform other duties outside of the liturgical context for the church and for society, doesn't prevent them from exhibiting many of manifestations of the logic of necessity as opposed to the logic of love. That depends on them, that depends on their relationships, that depends on social context, that depends on so many factors. So I think that actually it would be really naive to, and that's, I think, one mistake that both many theologians and secular thinkers have made, trying to not to see this distinction, but taking the Eucharist and the liturgy and the church and completely kind of forcing them into one unified whole without distinction, which then makes it very difficult to see how is the real power game and oppression that happens in church structure, how's that not part of liturgy and the Eucharist? And then I think if you proceed down that road, then the result of that is exactly Platonic separation. Then you end up saying, well, everything that belongs to this world is necessarily corrupt, and then, you know, it's hopeless, it must go to the very bottom of the structure of the liturgy, and then there is the eschatological reality out there, and we just hope it will come, and that's all of that, and ultimately the icon then, the existence ceases to be Christian, way of relating to the kingdom of God ceases to be an iconic nature and becomes representation, becomes an idol, if you will. So I think that liturgy is there precisely to keep this tension, to integrate the two, not to separate them in a Platonic way. But I just think it's not realistic to expect church structures, because they need to operate in this world, and they are composed of the people of this world, and they bring all of these imperfections and issues also into the liturgical context, to expect them outside of the liturgical context to exhibit some purely, angelic elements.
So you're advocating a kind of Eucharistic ecclesiology, but the critique of Eucharistic ecclesiology is exactly that the Eucharist is displaying a church very strongly hierarchically organized, which also continues in the church life later on. What would you say about this critique if you look upon Eucharistic ecclesiology as too limited to contain
this aspect? Absolutely. In the sense of disregarding everything else. And that's a challenge, because if you insist on the Eucharist as basically the only thing that is there to the church and church life and Christian life, you risk to disregard everything else. And that's, I'm not talking now about the power structures. I'm talking about all sorts of other practices, like ascetic practices, like personal prayer, like acts of loving kindness, helping other people, and embracing others, and all of these things that should be practiced. So I think that insisting on Eucharist and liturgy as this heart of the visible church, that's in the center, which is Christ. That is the central part, and I like to think of it as I said elsewhere, as concentric circles. So around this central one, there is a bigger one, and there is a bigger one, and the biggest one embraces the whole world and the visible and the invisible, creator and creation. So I don't think that it can be dangerous only if we just focus on some of those Eucharistic fundamentalists have been saying basically nothing else matters, everything else forget about everything else, forget about ascetic practices, forget about social and political contexts, forget about education, forget about everything. All that matters is participating in the Eucharist. In a very abstract way, you might even, of course, within a particular intellectual discourse, allow for that. But yeah, then the danger becomes precisely this, that then the Eucharistic discourse and serving the Eucharist would become something totally separate from everything else. And I think I like to look at the liturgy as this integrative factor, where everything is brought to that, and where this eschatological dimension is met with a historical one. But neither is transformed into something else.
So where would you find baptism in these concentric circles then?
Yeah, and baptism, I think, primarily means our demonstration of our freedom to give up on the necessities of this world and our aspiration to establish our existence on freedom and love. So leaving the necessities of this world, meaning social, political, family, biological, all other necessities that we are brought into this world with, and choosing community that is supposed to be free. So nobody should force you to be a member of the church. So you become a member of the church because that community is supposed to be established on freedom and love, up to the point, of course, and we exercise it to which that's possible in this world. So again, liturgy will not make us just bodiless beings, heavenly beings on earth, but by trying to liberate ourselves, by trying to overcome our limitations, by trying to allow for those relationships of love to become the foundation of our existence, we are becoming members or citizens of the heavenly kingdom.
So you seem to create a kind of dichotomy in your way of thinking between freedom and love as ideals and the necessities of this world. And wouldn't that be in line with the dividing lines that some groups are arguing for today? For example, the dividing line between creating creation also becomes a dividing line between the church and the world.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I see that, and as I said, I see that's exactly can be the case if we proceed down that road. If we are not capable of embracing the complexity and the paradox. But when I talk about freedom and I agree, there is that dichotomy. I'm very plain about it, very open about it, because I think there is a dualism there. Dualism not between the created and uncreated, or between the spiritual and the material. I think these are just kind of formal misperceptions or formal articulations of what is a fundamental dichotomy, and that's the dichotomy between freedom and necessity. But again, these are not simply concepts. We use those concepts to actually refer to some realities of our being, our existence, and our relationships. So the dichotomy, I think, is not there because we have the potential, we are stuck in one sense with our necessities. For example, limitations of our body. There is a little you can do about it, but not much. But at the same time, we have the potential for freedom to actually transform some and transcend some of those necessities and bring them into free existence as part of free relations of love. So that's why I don't think that is any more of a dualism, certainly not of a Platonic dualism, that we can find in just some of the basic things that Christianity deals with. And of course, if we want, we can now develop it more, but that would require another presentation, how and why this dualism doesn't, I think, affect all the other things that we talked about, the Eucharistic gathering and the role of the church. On the contrary, I think it actually presupposes that there is something like the church, because that's where those freedoms and necessities can be managed within the boundaries of this world, and at the same time being transformed to resemble the existence of the age to come. Without that part, then we are in danger of turning institutions of this world into what they are not, and that's kind of pseudo-ecclesiastical or pseudo-metaphysical entities. And that has been the case all the time throughout history. And every time the church tries to play that role, it actually becomes less and less institutional church, less and less of something that is shaped according to the Eucharistic model, something that exercises or is supposed to provide more room for freedom and love, and becomes more and more something that's primarily based on the interests of this world, and that means necessities.
So would you place freedom and necessity as two counterparts?
Yes.
Yes. Any more questions?
You didn't ask any question.
No, I asked. You said yes.
You said, okay.
I will come back to this.
Okay.
Then I conclude this lecture for today, and next lecture will be held on Monday, October 19th at the same time.
No.
What?
30.
No, that's right. Yeah.
1:30.
October 1:30. 1:30 p.m. on Monday, right? Yeah, 1:30 p.m. on Monday, same time as 1:30 p.m. Yeah, not the same time. 1:30 p.m. So 1/2 hour later, and then you will find the rest of the lectures on our website. There will be a change where Miriam Lingen-Hjelm will change with me, and I will have her lecture on the date of that lecture. Otherwise, you will find all information on our website. Next lecture, 1:30 p.m. on Monday, the 19th of October. And that's Professor Samuel Rubensson, our chair professor, who will introduce Eastern Christian studies. Thank you for today.